20s and 30s and 40s, not in war, but of what we would call natural causes. So we have created in our society an enormous number of single adults, post-married adults in some case, divorced or widowed adults. And these people have made the single lifestyle among older adults easily recognized in our society. That's another great group of human beings who need to have some sense of how you walk through the sexual revolution. Today there are unmarried couples living together, unmarried people living alone or with one or more roommates, divorced people living with their children, divorced people living without their children, widowed people living with or without children, gay and lesbian people living singly, gay couples, lesbian couples living together. Non-traditional families make up more than 50% of the households of America. So sexual activity outside marriage has become quite commonplace. When I was a pastor before I retired, I discovered that even in nursing homes, where elderly people are present, many of them single, that they form relationships and they actually live together without benefit of clergy, without marriage, because marriage would affect their Social Security, or marriage would affect their pensions, or marriage would affect their husband's or wife's will. They live together not apart from sexual activity. They live together not apart from being faithful to one another. So it's a new day. Is it an evil day? I don't think so. But it is a new day, and the old moral patterns simply no longer hold. There are people who think that these facts should never be mentioned. They believe that just talking about this creates more immorality. They got the idea that if the church talks about this, that everybody will rush right out and do it. Most of the people in this age group aren't even in the church to listen to what the church has got to say on that. They still believe that repressing sexual energy is possible and even desirable, though there is no evidence to support either. I bring these things up with regularity because this is our world. I cannot pretend I live in a different kind of world. I live in this world. And I have no choice but to live in this world, and neither do you. In previous generations, external pressure was employed to encourage what we defined as morality, but today all of those external pressures have been removed. So I also had to study changing patterns in heterosexual behavior for young adults. And please recognize that I had to study this as the father of 4 daughters and the father of 1 son. Of my 4 daughters today, 2 are married, 1 is divorced, 1 is single, and my 1 son is engaged to be married. So I've got him in sort of every stage of life. How do you begin to talk about what constitutes right and wrong in this arena? Well, the first thing I had to learn was that sex inside marriage is not always holy. It's again one of the things that you hear sort of parroted around, but I've been a pastoral counselor and a marriage counselor. I'd like to tell you that I've dealt with rape inside a marriage. I've dealt with sexual abuse inside a marriage. I've dealt with married couples who use sex as a weapon to beat each other around the head and shoulders. And I've long ago gotten over the idea that it is marriage that makes sex holy. Sex can be as unholy in a marriage as it can be inside any other relationship. Well, if it's not marriage that makes sex holy, what is it? Well, I think it's the quality of the relationship. And I think you need to understand that and to learn how to act upon it. Sex without love, I believe, is always evil. Always evil. Now, how one defines love may vary widely. But sex that is without love never enhances the life for either party. Loveless sex turns the whole participation into being less than human. If you are going to have a sexual partner for whom you have no love, I suggest you call up Hertz Rent-A-Body and use someone from that agency, because you're going to dehumanize whoever you make your partner, and you're going to dehumanize yourself, because anytime a human being relates to another human being as if they are a thing, that human being ceases to be as fully human as they were before they acted that way. So the first rule, if I'm going to sort of set a boundary of moral practice, the first rule I would articulate is that loveless sex is an oxymoron. Oh, it's not an oxymoron, but it's not moral. Sex without love never seems to me to enhance life. It never seems to me to enhance love. It always diminishes the person's ability to live fully. So that's an ethical boundary for me. Beyond that boundary, I name sexual behavior immoral. Sex apart from love is always wrong. When we go to the other end of the human experience, let me state that sex, when it is the ultimate expression of an intimate, fully committed, and exclusive loving relationship, I believe is never evil. Do I mean marriage by this? Well, I'm of the generation that would say probably that's what I mean. But I'm also well aware that that's not what it always means. I have come to know people, young couples who were unmarried, whose lives together were so beautiful and so life-giving that both of them were enhanced by their relationship, and I cannot call that evil. I've known lesbian couples and gay couples whose love was so life-giving to each other that they both became more fully human and more capable of loving beyond the boundaries of even that relationship. And I cannot, for the life of me, call that evil. So I believe that sex becomes holy when one partner loves the other partner for the partner's own sake, and that one builds into that relationship a kind of ultimate commitment, a willingness to live for and with that person in the totality of their humanity. It's love that goes beyond loving a person for what he or she can do for yourself. So I define this boundary: loving, exclusive, committed, life-giving, faithful sexual relationships always enhance life and therefore are always good. So those are my boundaries. An ultimate commitment with sex as a part of that relationship, where love marks that relationship, that's good. A sexual activity where there is no love, where the person is a thing used to gratify your needs or your desires, that's always evil. Those are my two ethical polarities. But the fact is that most human beings live somewhere between those two poles, where sex is practiced and morality is defended on almost a case-by-case basis. That means you've got an awful lot of decision-making to do. This is the arena in which most people make their decisions. You are given enormous freedom in this world. That freedom can be a source of your destruction. It can be a source of your enhanced humanity. But with enormous freedom always goes enormous responsibility. I don't think for a minute that I can stand before you and tell you what you have to do or what decisions have to be made for you inside your relationships. I can stand before you and say that I happen to be a Christian, and so Christianity informs my decisions. So let me close this by saying exactly how the Christian faith informs my decision-making as a human being and a sexual human being. I believe that an act that expands life for myself and for the person to whom that act is directed, that an act that expands life is good. I believe that an act that expands my capacity and the person to whom I am acting's capacity's ability to love, makes us more loving, is good. I believe that an act that comes out of my being, and when I act out of it, it expands my being and expands the being of the person who would be my partner, I think that is also good. So I make my values, not in a set of rules, but in the effects, in life, in love, in being. If an act expands life, enhances love, increases being for the two people, it participates in goodness. When I look at Jesus as the heart of my faith tradition, I see a fully alive person. Since I define God as the source of life, I say that I see God in Jesus. The only way I know how to worship the God of life is to live fully. And a disciple of this Jesus must act in such a way as to be an agent of life to everyone else. I also see Jesus as one who loved totally. And because I believe God is the source of love, I believe that I worship God when I love totally. And when love expands the being of the person, then that's an act of worship and an act of God. I see Jesus as one who was everything that he was created to be. And since I define God as the ground of all being, the way I worship God is to have the courage to be everything that I can be, and the way I'm a disciple of this God is to live in such a way as to enable every other human being to be everything that they can be. This is how my religion informs my sexual, ethical making decisions. I cannot tell you how you must live your life and make your decisions. I can only tell you that there are boundaries where morality is clearly defined, and there are boundaries where morality has to be on a case-by-case decision. But I can tell you that if you do not enhance the life of people with your actions, if you do not increase the ability of people by your actions to love others more abundantly, if you diminish the being of a person through your actions, it cannot possibly be good. So I commend you into the discussion of these issues, and I believe that this is an adequate basis for ethics that I think can and will endure in the foreseeable future. Well, thank you for your attention, and I expect some of you might have questions.
We have about 15 minutes for some questions. Bishop Spong likes to alternate male, female, so we get a balanced set of questions from you. And so we will try to answer as many questions as possible. Yes?
I sort of came to a very similar ethic a number of years ago after going through a very painful divorce, with one exception, which is that sex was good and proper in a relationship when it was mutually enhancing to the two individuals, with the caveat that it didn't do harm to a third person.
Yep.
Would you care to comment on that?
Well, I would agree with that. I think that if you're in a situation where your action diminishes anybody, not just your partner, but a third person, if you're violating somebody else's marriage, for example, I think you've got to be responsible for that. Let me tell you one illustration that I was pastorally involved in maybe 35 years ago. I had a couple in my congregation. The woman had a stroke at age 37 and was rendered paralyzed and sexually incompetent for the rest of her life by this stroke. The husband loved her dearly and assumed that he would make whatever sacrifice was necessary for the beauty and sanctity of their relationship, and he probably did that for maybe 5 years. And then he discovered that his life was becoming increasingly embittered, and that he was more and more hostile and edgy with his wife because unconsciously he was beginning to blame her for the fact that his life had been so badly altered. And in the course of this period of time, there was a widow in this town who was some 10 years older than this man. And they had been friends at one point, couple friends. And that relationship began to develop. There was no possibility that they would ever be marriage partners, but it began to develop. And after a while, it sort of slipped over the boundary and became an active sexual relationship with no demands being made on either of the two people to leave the marriage of the woman with the stroke and to begin a new relationship that was open in public. And in the course of my life, the two people, the man and this widow, came to talk to me because they were caught up in the guilt of the culture about their relationship. The wife did not know. In some sense, she was violated. But as I worked with this couple, trying to come to some ethical decision about it, and they were both concerned enough to try to do what they felt was the right thing to do. The data was that this husband was far more loving to his sick wife because of this relationship of love and fulfillment. The widow was far more fulfilled as a human being and no longer sort of living in the bitterness of loneliness. And I had a hard time finding anybody that was hurt in that relationship. Now, whether the wife would have been hurt if she had known, I do not know. That's always a risk, and that's always where you can't make general ethical principles by individual case histories. But it seemed to me that so long as they kept that relationship extremely discreet, so that it wasn't part of the gossip mill of that community, that life was enhanced for all of the people. Now, that may be pure casuistry. That may be people trying to work it out so they can do what they really wanted to do and think it's all good. But at least that caused me, as a very moralistic young priest, I couldn't have been more than in my mid-30s when I was dealing with that, it caused me to begin to look at life from a broader perspective than just the right and wrong perspective of my religious early childhood training. Is there a lady that would like to ask a question? Yes, ma'am.
I'd like to ask about
About what? Abortion is a terribly complex issue. My position on abortion is that I think it ought to be rare. I think it ought to be safe. I think it ought to be legal. And I think it ought to be available from fully qualified medical resources. In some sense, I think abortion is always a tragedy. And I wish that we could deal with the other issues that make the high instance of abortion in our society a little bit better able to be managed, like I think we ought to be dealing with effective sex education in high school. And I think we ought to provide birth control for anybody that wants it under any set of circumstances. And I think if you're not willing to do that, you have a moral obligation in the society to make sure that a woman has the right to a safe and medically approved abortion, because I happen to believe in the right to life for women. I believe that if abortion is made illegal, that will not stop abortion. That'll only stop safe abortion, and it'll put women at risk. But I wish we had a society whereby our corporate action we could limit, not by law, but limit by necessity, the need for anybody ever to have an abortion. That sort of straddles the issue, but that's the best I can come up with. A man. Yes, sir.
I had an interesting case. There was a woman of my acquaintance who was, by all normal reckonings, considered a prostitute by profession. But she was a prostitute with a difference. She regarded this as sex, as a service, and dealt exclusively with men who were disfigured, who were in the normal course of events not feasibly expected to be able to obtain a partner in the ordinary sense. And I have difficulty categorizing this particular case.
Yep.
Interested in your comment.
I'd suggest you write a story about it. You see, human life is so varied, so wonderfully varied, that when you make hard and fast and abstract rules, there's always somebody that falls outside the rules. There's a story in the Bible about a woman who is a prostitute. Her name is Tamar. The reason she's a prostitute, according to this Bible story, is that she married Judah's son. And Judah's son died before she had any children. And under the law of Levirate marriage that marked the Old Testament, it was the responsibility of the second son to marry his deceased brother's wife, because you'd have more than one wife in that society, and raise up children to his brother. And his brother was a man named Onan, and Onan refused to do that. Onan, according to the biblical text, spilled his seed on the ground rather than have relations with his brother's widow. And the only other boy they had in the family was a 2 or 3 year old. Now, in that society, a woman was not capable of going out and getting a job and supporting herself. A woman was the property of her father, and she had left her father to go live with her husband, and now she was the property of her husband, and her husband had died, and the family of her husband had refused to carry out the social contract prevalent in that society to take care of her. So she had one choice, and that was to become a prostitute. That was a way of survival for her. And so she puts on the clothes of a prostitute, and she's sitting in the town village waiting for customers. And guess who comes along to be her customer? Her father-in-law, Judah. She recognizes him, but he didn't recognize her. So he hires her services for the day, and then he doesn't have enough money to pay her. It's all in the Bible. It's not what you hear in church on Sunday morning, but it's all in the Bible. You can read it in the book of Genesis. He doesn't have the money to pay for her services, and so he gives her a piece of his clothing as a surety that he will come and redeem this piece of clothing, a belt or something, I've forgotten what it was, and she will be paid when she surrenders this bond that he left. And he never comes back. In the meantime, Tamar has become pregnant through that liaison. Then her father-in-law, Judah, hears that Tamar is pregnant, and he knows that she does not have a husband, so he knows that she's guilty of adultery. And so he arranges a stoning party. He's going to execute Tamar. And they bring Tamar out and get ready to cast the stones on this adulterous woman. And just before they do, she says, "Oh, by the way, I am pregnant by the owner of this piece of clothing." And she holds up Judah's belt or whatever it was. And Judah recognizes it. And Judah stops the stoning. And Judah says to this woman, "You are more moral than I am." Now, as I say, that's a Bible story you don't hear read in church very often. But it's not only in the book of Genesis, it's also in the genealogy of Matthew's gospel, because Tamar has twins. And one of those twins is named Perez. And Matthew says that's the line that went from Abraham to Jesus of Nazareth. So that this incestuous relationship of a prostitute is part of the line, says Matthew, that brought about the life of Jesus of Nazareth. Again, a Bible story you never hear very often in church. But it only illustrates to me that sometimes what we have regarded as immoral is a necessary survival technique on the part of people that we have repressed and treated unjustly because they happen to be women. So I'm careful with judgment. I don't think that excuses all of the immorality, but I'm careful with judgment. I also know that the upper classes have kept prostitutes in business over the centuries while they go to church and proclaim morality on Sunday morning. I grew up in the South. The rich people in the South bought the Klan uniforms for the poor whites in the South to wear to scare the blacks. And the reason they did that is as long as you could keep the poor whites and the blacks at war with one another, you could control both of them. So it was an economic technique. And I think we've treated blacks unjustly, and I think we've treated women unjustly. And when we do, there's always something that falls outside the boundaries of our morality. And yet, you have to say, you can't be quite as judgmental about this. So I think your story is a good story. I'd appreciate your writing about it and making people debate that particular issue. Is there a lady would like to ask a question. Yes, ma'am.
You spoke yesterday a little bit about rebellion and youth and how we should allow it.
Rebellion in youth.
Can you go a little further?
I did enough of it. Well, I don't know that I would cast myself as a child-rearing expert, though I've had lots of experience. But I do think that the job of a parent is to raise the child to be whole, to be free, not to be convenient to the parent. And so often what we do is to sacrifice the vitality and the health of the child in the name of our convenience. And that starts very early. I hear young mothers say, I have a good baby. What they mean by that is a convenient baby that sleeps through the night. We apply moral judgments to sleeping patterns. A good baby is a baby that doesn't give you a lot of trouble. A bad baby is one who has colic and sleeps off and on through the night and gets you awake. I think you need to be careful about that. Particularly as you get older, your child has got to rebel in order to be free. And the dynamics between parents and children is so powerful. My father, who died when I was 12, my father had me convinced as a child that I was the most incompetent person in the world. The only thing I remember my father ever saying to me is, you can't do anything right. That was a regular song. Now, he was defining me out of his need. If I had allowed that definition to be the ultimate definition of my life, I certainly wouldn't be standing here before you at this moment. But somehow, from some other relationship, and I don't even know where, I got the strength to say, I don't believe my father's judgment of me is correct. And so I've lived my life. I'll soon be 70 years old, and I've lived my life trying to prove to my father that he's wrong. And he's been dead a long time. He died in 1943, and I'm still proving it to him. I'm still not free of that message. That's what you've got to be careful with. You've got to be careful about raising your child so that your child is not free to be whoever your child is. And your child is not a little copy of you. Your child is a very distinct human being. There's never been one like it. It's your genetic code and your husband's genetic code who has produced a brand new thing. I have this present standing beside me which indicates that I probably ought to go faster. But because I happen to be a clergyman, I always think of a biblical story. And the biblical story I think of here is when young shepherd boy David was the only one in Israel who was willing to go out and fight with the great Philistine giant named Goliath. And they brought young David, and they decided that it would be just inhuman to send him out to fight Goliath without armor. So they put all the armor of the adult world upon him. And young David can hardly move. And he says, that is not who I am. I am another generation. If I'm going to fight Goliath, I've got to fight him my way, which is a shepherd boy with a slingshot. So David takes off the armor of the previous generation, puts on that which is appropriate to his age, and goes and does battle and is victorious, says this story. I think the temptation for parents is always to put the armor of their generation upon their children and to say to their children, this is the only way you can deal with the issue. Your child has to do it his or her way. And you raise your children to lose them. And if you do not lose them, you will never have them. There's nothing quite so sad as a man who's never been able to cut the umbilicus cord from his mother, and so he's never free to be himself. And his mother thinks of him sometimes as a most devoted son. But it's just amazing how often accidents happen, like when the son spills hot chocolate all over his mother or sort of pushes her wheelchair down the state capitol steps by accident. Of course, you work out your hostility one way or another. And there's enough stories in the newspapers about children killing their parents that an ultimate tragedy has taken place. So you raise your children to lose them. You raise them so that they will be free to be themselves, not a carbon copy of you. And that means you've got to allow them to express themselves, and you just hope they don't do it in a way that kills them, because sometimes that's what happens. And I stand before you as one who's probably lucky to be alive, because I can remember doing some things when I was 15, 16, 17, that but for the grace of God, I would have been killed. I can remember particularly priding myself on my ability to go over 70 miles an hour and to swap drivers while we were doing it, so that if one of us didn't have our license and the police was after us, we could still drive 70 miles an hour and get the driver with the right license in his pocket behind the wheel. I'm not proud of that. And I'm really glad I'm alive. And if one of my children did that, I think I'd skin them. And if my mother had found out, she probably would have skinned me too, but she didn't find out. But, you know, that's the way it is with children. And it's frightening to be a parent, but it's even more frightening to have an adult child who's not free to leave home emotionally or physically. And we still have a lot of that in our society. Are you telling me we're out of time?
I'm telling you, we can have one more question and one more scary answer.
Okay. I guess it's a man's turn. Anybody? Yes, sir. You've already had one. Let's see.
Wait a minute, because I've got something for you.
Well, I don't want to break the rules here. Anybody else want to speak before he speaks? Any other male? Okay, you're absolved.
Cast your mind back 47 years. You were in Chapel Hill.
Is that long ago? I can't do math backwards.
You had a brother
Yep,
named Willie,
yep.
and he had a roommate named Tommy Sumner.
You're Tommy Sumner?
I'm Tommy Sumner.
Oh, I'm a dog. Welcome, Tommy. I'd like to tell you that my brother Willie is not Willie any longer. He's very sophisticated. His name is Will. And he's a professor at the Episcopal Theological Seminary in Austin, Texas. And he runs something called the Austin Counseling Center out of that seminary. And I'm delighted to meet you. And he just had a melanoma taken off his head 2 weeks ago. And he got along fine, and we think he's going to be okay. But that's the update I can give you on my brother, whom I happen to love very much and admire a great deal. Thank you. It's been wonderful to be with you folks. Thanks for coming this afternoon.